We do want to get right to the latest developments this morning in the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17. There are growing concerns this morning over the security of that 6-square-mile debris field. Many international investigators are being held back from the area, which is under rebel control. We're also learning more about the 298 people who were on board that flight, 80 of them children and one, a 19-year-old American citizen.
President Obama warning of the possibility of new sanctions against Russia, saying the downing of the plane should be a wake-up call for Europe and the world. We're covering this from the Pentagon and Ukraine. We want to begin with Keir Simmons in Ukraine. Keir, good morning.
Lester, good morning. Here in Donetsk, the militia in control of this region are being accused of not letting international investigators get near to the crash site. They are absolutely denying that. But the Ukrainian government claims that they are destroying evidence and making it hard to recover bodies.
Guarding the wreckage, the Russian-backed rebels who some already accuse of causing the crash. The debris still smoking, strewn around. And for 2 nights now, the personal possessions and bodies of the dead have been left in the open. White markers identify where remains have been found. The Malaysian government increasingly angry.
Malaysia is deeply concerned that the crash site has not been properly secured. The integrity of the site has been compromised. The world has a moral obligation to ensure that the remains of all victims are recovered and treated with respect.
And when an international team arrived at the crash site Friday,
what we are here for is to see what measures are in place, whether the perimeter is secured.
They said they were given limited access. Whoever crosses the line will face the consequences, said a rebel commander. Amid the tension, 2 FBI agents and an NTSB investigator are on their way to Ukraine. US officials say Malaysian Flight 17 was shot down by a surface-to-air missile that was fired from Ukraine very near the Russian border. The relatives of the 298 people killed, including one American citizen, will want to know who fired the missile. But that may be difficult to establish, with officials sent packing by a militia who may not want the world to know how a civilian aircraft was blown apart.
Now, the official body that might best be able to seal off the site and investigate would be the Ukrainian government, you would think, but it's so unlikely that these militia would let them close, since they are the body that the militia are fighting, unless there's some really shocking news just emerging. One militia leader saying at a news conference that it is possible that some local people may have used the credit cards of some victims. Esther?
Absolutely awful. Keir Simmons in Ukraine, thank you.
Today, U.S. intelligence officials are trying to zero in on just who fired the missile that brought down this plane. Our Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski is following that part of the story for us. Mick, good morning.
Good morning, Erica. As we know, U.S. military officials, intelligence officials, and even President Obama have come to the conclusion that, yes, it was a missile that brought down that plane, a missile fired from rebel-held territory there in eastern Ukraine. But based on a wide array of intelligence sources, some U.S. officials suspect, and even others are convinced, that the Russian military played a direct role in shooting down that Malaysian airliner. According to the sources, it's believed that Russian trainers and advisors who crossed the border from Russia into Ukraine to train and advise those rebel forces there in eastern Ukraine on how to use some of these sophisticated weapon systems, they're convinced that maybe one or more of these Russians were directly involved in shooting down the plane, or at least gave the command to the rebel forces to fire the shot. In addition, there was an interesting video, which U.S. officials don't dispute, released yesterday, which shows that very missile system on a back of a flatbed truck. One of its 4 missiles was missing, and it was headed toward the Russian border. And in somewhat of an ironic, if not tragic twist, U.S. officials also believe that the very missile system that brought down the airliner may have been from the Ukrainian military that had been seized earlier by those rebel forces, Erica.
In terms of, Mick, as you mentioned all these things we saw that video allegedly of the missile launcher being moved, and Keir talked about allegations of evidence being destroyed. What is the thinking when some of these American folks who are headed in, as we heard, get on the ground? How much will they be able to do?
Well, some of the plane crash experts we've been talking to say the black box itself probably wouldn't say much, except pinpoint the time at which the missile struck the airplane. But they would like to have access to the remnants of the plane itself, the fragments of the wreckage that would not only show exactly where the missile hit, but it would have telltale chemical or explosive residue on the plane to confirm that it was a missile that brought down the plane. But quite frankly, officials we're talking to say they have enough evidence, other evidence from spy satellites, intercepts and the like, that nails it down. It was a missile fired from eastern Ukraine that brought down the plane.
Jim Miklashevsky this morning. Jim, thanks.
I want to bring in now Michael Leiter. He's an NBC national security analyst and a former top White House counterterrorism official. Also, Georgetown University professor Angela Stent is the author of The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century, and joins us here as well. Good morning to both of you. Thanks for coming on.
Morning.
Michael, if I can begin with you, following up Jim Miklashevsky's report there, the U.S. seems to have evidence pointing toward either Russian-backed forces or even perhaps some Russians themselves. How solid a case and what kind of eyes on the ground does the U.S. have there?
Lester, I think it's extremely solid. SA-11 missile from the Russian side. Exactly who was operating, I think that really is the sketchier part. Frankly, I don't think, though, that that's going to be an integral part of what the next steps are. My guess is they're going to want to narrow that down as much as they can, but knowing that Russia has supplied and supported is enough to already drive the policy discussions. If they were actually operating, that's that much worse, but it's not a critical piece to the investigation. Well,
you teed up my next question. It's to Professor Stent. If the U.S. gets the Russian fingerprints on this, what next? What more can the U.S. politically do? And also I want you to comment a little bit about the president putting some subtle or not so subtle pressure on Europeans in this case.
Well, I mean, what we would like to do is for the Russians to stop playing a double game. Mr. Putin says on the one hand, you know, we need to de-escalate. On the other hand, as we've heard, men and material, weapons have been supplied to the Ukrainians. I think there's the option of more sanctions, of even tougher sectoral sanctions. We obviously would like our European allies to join us in this. They've been reluctant to do so. If you think about the majority of people who died on that plane were Europeans. So I think that for the U.S., there are limited options. I guess we can give a little more assistance to the Ukrainians. We should be heavily involved in investigating this terrible crime scene. But there are limits to what we can do.
And Michael, what about the U.S. introducing more weapons into an already volatile area? And I guess the larger question, is there really a U.S. national security interest here at the end of the day? Obviously, from a humanitarian point of view, this is outrageous. But what's the U.S. interest here?
Well, I think what we've seen is this conflict really can provide destabilization across a range of geographic areas. This is a plane flying from the heart of Europe across Central Asia and getting shot down. So this is really not just a regional conflict. In terms of further support, I think the U.S. can do more to support Ukraine. Certainly could deepen intelligence support, which they need to understand what the rebels are doing, could provide further logistics, and, of course, always the opportunity to expand economic sanctions, and, as the professor said, support Europe in doing the same.
And Professor Stent, are we crossing a line here in terms of U.S.-Russian relations? Obviously, the Ukraine situation has caused real problems, but is there a line here that's about to cross to take this into a deeper crisis between the two countries?
Well, I think if, you know, depending on what the investigation shows, and if the Russians won't cooperate and they won't admit the Russian involvement in the general separatist movement there, then I think the relationship will deteriorate even further. It's pretty bad now. It started really to deteriorate when Mr. Snowden was given asylum in Russia. So I think we could be crossing a line. And I think things could actually get worse if Russia continues to try and destabilize eastern Ukraine.
All right. Well, fascinating discussion. Michael Leiter, Angela Stent, thanks to both of you for being with us this morning. We appreciate it.